Hey guys, it's Rue, and welcome to the series American History. This is going to be episode 1. I don't know how many episodes there are going to be, but episode 1 we are going to be going over the Geneva Bible that was brought over by the Mayflower, and a little bit about King James and some of the thoughts that led to some people leaving. I'm not going over the Thanksgiving story. I'm not interested in that right now. We have a much different path that I want to go down when going into American history, and I want to kind of lead us to some of the treaties that we went through, some of the acts we went through, who actually settled in America, for what reasons did we start a war, and what were the conditions of the war ending, the Revolutionary War. And then we're going to go into further things as well. We're going to get into some strange things in the 1800s, but that's going to be a couple episodes from now. We'll get to the 1900s and those wars as well, but we're starting specifically as early as possible because I don't even think we understand that at this point. And if we did, it might explain a lot about what we see today. But hopefully you find and learn a lot of things in these videos that you didn't know about American history or the Bibles or whatever, and I don't know, maybe you learned something, maybe not. But hopefully with this series, my goal will be to kind of clear up some of what they haven't told us, so perhaps our wider view of American history is clearer than just what we've been told that they want us to understand, right? So, welcome to American History by Rue, guys. Enjoy it. I was just scrolling through some videos and stumbled across some professor who brought up some articles, some treaties, and read from them, and kind of made me think a little bit. So I guess we'll start this with what we're looking at here. The Mayflower at Sea, one of the most popular stories that we all learned to kind of give us the idea of who came to America and why. So we can go read it here, but I think it's safe to say most people that actually can kind of remember what they learned, we kind of learned that people came here to escape either Church of England or escape rule of England, the King, Britain, whatever, for whatever reason they were escaping something they didn't agree with to come here to a free land that's new. And so certainly true, I guess. I mean, I can't just speak for what is fact and what is not when there's not evidence from a time period that had no cameras, but sure, I'm not saying the Mayflower story is not true. It probably is true, but that's one story. But let's go look at this story, actually. So here is what we kind of learned, right? Kind of the whole Thanksgiving story. I don't want to go into it because most of y'all probably know it. Probably don't want to hear it again, but essentially that is the idea, right? It transported the English families in 1620. Cape Cod, right? So, differing from their contemporaries, the Puritans who sought to reform and purify the Church of England, the Pilgrims chose to separate themselves from the Church of England, which forced them to pray in private. They escaped and ran and hid for a while, and that wasn't working out. So eventually they came to America. They weren't the first ones. 1620 was not the first time someone came over here. King James himself had people here earlier than that. But these particular individuals, yes, in 1620 came over for this reason. So they believed it was beyond redemption due to its resistance to reform and Roman Catholic past. So they didn't think there was any hope for the religious situation over in Europe, right? And during this time would be who? This would be during King James's reign, right? So King James would be King James I over England and King James VI over Scotland. So we have a group of people coming to America that did not like. That's the first thing that kind of caught my mind. Okay, the people that came over here came over with what? The Geneva Bible. King James didn't like the Geneva Bible. He wrote the King James Bible because he disagreed with the opinions of the people and the interpretation of the Bible. in the Geneva. He didn't like it. But those people who liked the Geneva were the ones that came over here under this ideology. The one that started America. Yet what's the most popular Bible today? King James Bible, right? Everyone says if you want to learn like a more accurate version, you go back to King James, right? Because New King James, NIV stuff, it makes it easier to read, but King James is more accurate, right? But these people didn't like him. That started America. Interesting. So you can kind of see why this time period sparked my curiosity and why I wanted to learn more about it, because there's at least one thing there that's off. But anyway, so these people came over for that reason. You got Thanksgiving, which I'm not even going to go into. I'm not concerned with at the moment. But interesting. Were these the only type of people who came to America? So we have 1783, the Paris Treaty, that gets us to declare our independence. But we have a whole over a decade of people coming here before we become a nation. So who came here? Was it literally only mostly these people who wanted to escape England? Because if that's the case, I can understand why we became independent. But I am curious how we became independent and what is in that treaty as well, because what's in that treaty is also interesting. So anyway, let's keep going. I am going to stick to the King James and the Geneva Bible stuff first. And then we'll kind of get into the history of what happened in the independence and the treaty. I kind of want to go in order because I kind of want to get an idea of who was coming over, what the ideas were, what was going on in the time, what led to these Bibles being printed, right? We all thought, okay, maybe not we all thought, but generally speaking, we think that King James is kind of like the first major English Bible written. Its purpose was to give people a book to be able to read in their homes. That was easier than the bishop's book, right? So I never really thought what came before that and why did King James write that book. So we have a couple Bibles before King James, realistically, right? Tyndale, Coverdale, we have Geneva. One of the most popular ones that came out was the Geneva Bible. So I'm going to read this to you. Yeah, Tyndale gave his life for it. Coverdale and others completed his work. King Henry VIII eventually relented and allowed the publication of the Holy Bible in the English language. This is not that particular Bible, but about the Bible that came to America on the Mayflower, okay? And then disappeared into history, overshadowed by another lesser work, right? In 1560, a new Bible was published. This Bible was groundbreaking, and although little known today and mostly ignored in history, every Christian is blessed by the efforts of its translators and publishers. This is the Geneva Bible, using the work of Tyndale, Coverdale, and other pioneers who often put their lives in danger to bring the Bible into the lives of the common people. It was the first Bible to break the books into numbered chapters and verses. The publishers added considerable marginal notes to help people understand the verses and also cross-referenced many passages. Now this is important because this type of stuff is exactly what King James disagreed with. So we'll find out here later, but thus uniting the Bible into a cohesive whole. Most people today would not know how to read or study the Bible if this information was removed. This is exactly why King James didn't like it, and that is exactly the type of stuff he removed when he rewrote the Geneva. He removed all of this stuff that they added. Even though it's exactly what helped people understand it. He didn't like the translation though, and what they taught from it. It is also invaluable to commenters and pastors, right? So, the Geneva Bible was hated by both the nobility and the church. The problem was those pesky marginal notes and cross-references. They were critical of the growing problem of slavery, an issue for English ship captains who were beginning to make money transporting slaves from Africa to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South America. The notes criticized the clergy, supporting the idea of lay elders rather than only a professional class, and they were also critical of the Pope, and worst of all, they were against the divine right of the king to rule. Okay. So the book that came over to America on the Mayflower, granted, again, the Mayflower did not consist of the majority of people that established and set up America, or quote unquote legally owned America at that time. Certainly some people came over and claimed land. Now these terms are very important. Individuals did come over and claim land, but Europe also came over and claimed land, England and Britain specifically. So there was a lot of British subjects and a lot of English colonies. So we have to remember that it was very varied in who actually came over here. So there was certainly a story of people out of Mayflower, but really we got to look at the truth of what actually happened back there and why the Revolutionary War happened and how it got resolved. But anyway, because we're free, right? Free and clear. We won the war, right? Maybe. Probably not. Certainly looks like it. The history books certainly tell us we did. But we'll look at that in a minute. But I found this very interesting because the religion that came over was a religion who picked a book that basically called out the Pope and the king and everything they believed. And they changed it. They said, if you can't change and become more like this, then... So, interesting. What does the Geneva Bible teach, right? So clearly there's something important here, and it's the basis of why the King James was written. All right, so since he didn't like that book, the only solution was to block it because it was way too popular. Way too many people liked this book and liked the interpretation and the way it slandered the church and the king. So, of course, block it. The Bishop's Bible was published. It was a terrible Bible. They didn't do a very good job. Multiple revisions were needed, right? So, the Geneva stood in his way still at that point. So, consequently, James assembled a team of translators in 1611, okay? So, it incorporated the Geneva chapter and verse breaks, so it kind of kept with that idea. It also originally had the Apocrypha. The Geneva Bible originally had the Apocrypha, but also the Geneva Bible itself had it removed later as well. So, but both books originally included the Apocrypha. The people did not flock to King James. When the King James was first printed, they did not flock to it. They preferred still the Geneva. So what now? What could the king do? He banned the publishing of the Geneva Bible and authorized only his new Bible to be published in English. Okay, this dude realizes that the people are uprising and recognizing the corruption of the king and the church. So he tries to write a new Bible. People don't fall for it. It doesn't become popular. People don't like it. They still prefer the Geneva. So he bans it and says, okay, you can't have this. You must have this. Okay. It's kind of like back when Constantine, Rome tried for so long to stop the truth spreading. Right? So what did they do? Well, if you can't beat them, you join them. They become Christian, and then they have the Council of Nicaea shortly after, where they decide what Christianity is. Shortly after just becoming Christian, they get to decide, right? This dude pops up. These non-Christian individuals running Rome convert after numerous attempts to take down Christianity, they convert and very quickly after decide to tell the rest of the world what the definition of Christianity is, and that's what we go with from then on, even though many people disagreed. That was only a couple hundred years after Christ died, right? Don't you think it at all plausible that when this kind of stuff happens, evil might try something to corrupt it, right? Well, I don't know. I guess you'd have to go back and actually study the Council of Nicaea. It seems like it's certainly brought up and people know of it, and they certainly stand by it and what was determined. But how far back did we go to determine whose argument was what? And did we study the opposite arguments? I don't know. I don't think we study it nearly enough. I think we just accept a lot of what we're told. But anyway, so I mean, also it's a game of telephone, because even back then that was happening, right? And we're looking at the 1600s. This is 1,000 years later, more than 1,000 years later, and we're still playing a game of telephone with the Bible, right? Geneva was the favored because people were waking up to the truth of corruption. But now look what we're on today. We're on the Bible that they hated back then because they recognized the corruption, and now we're on the King James, and many revisions and changes from the King James. But anyway, so from 1616 forward, the Geneva began to fade from history. The King James underwent several revisions, the most important being the removal of the Apocrypha, although it continued to be included in some printings into the 1800s. All of the King James printings prior to 1666 contained the Apocrypha, and the inclusion of it ended entirely in 1826. But most specifically, all of them up until that point had it, and that's when they started disappearing. For cost savings, not because it does not belong. Right. We just can't afford to print that stuff. Right. Got it. Okay. Separatists remained loyal to the Geneva in large part, and the Mayflower Pilgrims brought the Geneva to America. So it's interesting to me how we've kind of flipped on our attitude, right? These individuals were trying to rise up and get away from King James, yet today we're on King James. So the biggest changes being the removal of basically the side notes, which criticized basically the government, because they read through it and they used the side notes to show you how the Bible actually criticizes what they were doing in that time. So it was teaching them corruption. But it's weird how time passes and somehow we're like, wait, the Christians of early America kind of had a slightly different viewpoint of things. But again, they weren't the majority of who came to America, to be honest. So I do want to get into that, but I think first I also kind of want to bring up something that maybe we don't know about King James, and perhaps why people didn't like King James. You might find that the story is kind of similar to what happens today, right? What happens when a president, our current president, shows up somewhere? They chant a few things, right? People tend to chant about people they don't like in their face, like they throw it at. They did that back then too, right? They would walk the streets and say things inappropriate about the president, right? Or the king. Or queen, in this instance, as they called him. So the people that came to America, the people that disliked the king, whom they called queen, jokingly, preferred this Bible, to which he was offended by. Okay. Are we starting to get the picture here? So who is King James, right? We certainly know that he's the one who wrote the Bible. We certainly know, okay, maybe not everybody knows that he was a king of two different places, but yeah, he was first of England, sixth of Scotland. So personal relationships of James the sixth and first, sixth being Scotland, first England, King James, who wrote the book, right? The Bible, King James Version. So James the sixth and first certainly enjoyed the company of handsome young men, sometimes shared his bed with his favorites, and often passionate in his expressions of love for them. James was married to Anne of Denmark, with whom he fathered 8 children. and he railed fiercely against sodomy. Okay. You have today, many historians and commenters affirm that given the evidence, which I've looked at myself and I'm kind of in agreement with these individuals, even after having understood that during this time it was normal to have, for kings, well, and even still, kings in general, that type of position tends to have bedchambermen, right? They have people that wait on them. And certainly, yes, it would be more appropriate that a man do it than a woman do it. But let's just look at anyone who knows the recent kings and queens and what they're like. What if the current king had, Mr. Charles had a bedchamberman who he was constantly passionate about in front of the rest of the world, which I'm pretty sure they're intentionally not doing that, and that particular man was known to lay in his same bed rather than the wife laying in the bed with the king. That's a weird time. And you can certainly say, well, that's just the norm back then, but why was it the norm? What do we know about these particular types of individuals, right? Okay. This was, during that time, a topic that was constantly talked about on the streets, much like you see today. How are we talking about the elite that we see today and what we've learned about them? That was what was going on back then. They were walking the streets and making fun of Queen James. Okay? Because of the evidence that he has against him with his relationships. So, James's relationships with his favorites clearly were sexual, according to most historians, right? Or, sorry, many historians, but also I agree. Others regard the evidence as more ambiguous and needing to be understood in the terms of 17th century forms of masculinity, they were very different than today. Like, I get that. But still, given what we know, what we've learned about the elite, what we've learned that they've done in past, maybe not everybody has seen the evidence, but we've known them to cross-dress. We've known them to be like this for centuries. Longer. And if you really want to get into it, probably a couple thousand years. It's not unknown that this is typical, that there ends up being this type of relationship and this type of elite, okay? So, basically, yes, he took a severe stance towards sodomy, right? He gave guidance to judges that pardons should not be given to such horrible crimes, but then you have someone come down and make a joke, right? Basically, journalists and stuff. This must seem rather extraordinary to those who have this stance that he's taking against sodomy must seem rather extraordinary to those who have a notion that a pardon in this case is what he himself, had he been a subject and not the king, he would have needed himself, might have stood in need of. He would have needed a pardon. Okay? They're telling you it's odd how extreme he's being towards this, given we understand what he does. This is what they were saying back then, okay? Many historians did not discuss, or discuss only obliquely, the clear fact that James's choice of favorites was rooted, at least in part, in same-sex attraction. For example, the 1885 to 1900 Dictionary of National Biography refers only, in the context of Carr, to James's partiality to worthless Scotsmen, if only they were sprightly and active, and to his inordinate fondness for Villiers. Okay. So, just again, pointing out his fondness for, right, odd individuals, worthless, quote-unquote worthless Scotsmen, right, that were attractive. Basically, he was married to Anne of Denmark. He didn't have a child first right away, right? Prince Henry was born in 1594, so 5 years after their marriage. Because in July of 1592, okay, 2 years before Prince Henry was born, 2 years before, James Halkerston was suspected of writing verses that suggested King James was homosexual and left his wife a virgin. So this person brings up, oh, he doesn't have a kid yet because he's gay, right? So what does he do? That's an interesting timing, right? Took 5 years, but suddenly this person is making these rumors. Can't have those rumors, right? So we have a child, right? Between 1593 and 1595, James was romantically linked with Anne Murray, later Lady Glamis, or Glamis, whatever, whom he addressed in verse as my mistress and my love, in a poem he wrote called Anne Dream whatever of his mistress, the Lady Glamis. She was the daughter of John Murray, first Earl of Tullibardine, master of the king's household, and also had different names. So, again, he had 8 children, being the last born during 1607, and then by 1606, it's claimed that they were living in separate establishments. James lost interest in his wife, and it was said that she led a sad, reclusive life afterward, appearing at court functions on occasion. So, with not only that, having a child shortly after, people were making claims against him, right? He also, very shortly after, 1593, 1592, it was claimed that he was leaving his wife a virgin because, right? But then, 1593 and 1595, for a couple years, he writes a poem about his affair with this. Okay, it seems he's setting up a situation here. What happened with Princess Diana? Is he straight? No. I think we have the exact same situation here. They act in certain ways to appear a certain way so that these things don't become a problem. Although we see even today we make those claims about the people, right? It's quite obvious actually today who they are, and it's been revealed to us what the elite are, okay? This was exactly the same situation, and during this time there were people trying to get away from King James, the church, and just Britain and England all together, right? They were trying to get away from this. They brought over the Geneva Bible. At least some of the people. Again, right, back to the only some of the people that came over were trying to do that, right? All right, Esme Stuart. Having arrived from France, Stuart was an exotic visitor who fascinated the young James. The two became extremely close, and it was said by an English observer that from the time he was 14 years old and no more, that is, when the Lord Stuart came into Scotland, even then, he began to clasp someone in the embraces of his great love above all others, and that James became in such love with him, as in the open sight of the people, often he will clasp him about the neck with his arms and kiss him. The king first made Aubigny a gentleman in the bedchamber, and then later appointed him to Privy Council. The Scottish ministry was also warned that the Duke sought to draw the king to carnal lust. Robert Carl, first of Somerset, fell off a horse and broke his leg. According to Thomas Howard, first Earl of Suffolk, James fell in love with the young man, and as the years progressed, showered Carr with gifts. Carr was made a gentleman of the bedchamber, and he was noted for his handsome appearance as well as his limited intelligence. Also made Knight of Garter, Privy Councillor, and so. Duke of Buckingham. The last of James's favorites was George Villiers, the son of, that person's knight. Anyway, they had met in 1614 around the same time that the situation with Somerset was deteriorating. Buckingham was described as exceptionally handsome, intelligent, and honest. In 1615, James knighted him, and 8 years later, he was the first commoner in more than a century to be elevated to a dukedom. Duke of Buckingham. Restoration of Apethrop Hall, undertaken 2004 and 2008, revealed a previously unknown passage linking the bedchambers of James and Villiers. The king was blunt and unashamed in his avowal of love for Buckingham and compared it to Jesus' love of John. Interestingly enough, Buckingham became good friends with James's wife, Anne of Denmark. And here's what she said. Letters begging him to be always true to her husband. In a letter to James, Buckingham said, Sir, all the way hither I entertained myself, your unworthy servant, with this dispute, whether you loved me now better than at the time, which I shall never forget, at Farnham, where the bed's head could not be found between the master and his dog. Now remember, Anne and him were kind of like separated, basically. Obviously, she was still, right, wife, but they didn't live together. They weren't really, it's not how kings really were. What does that scripture say about the individuals who don't like women, do they? They don't prefer women, do they? That's one heck of a way to put it. She certainly sounds like, I pray you'll always be true to my husband. But to say where the bed's head could not be found between the master and his dog, that's quite the statement. I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to get gross on here, but that was the way things ran back then. And it seems like Anne was just like, okay, it is what it is. This is how these men are. They prefer men over women. Okay. This is the man. The man that wrote the King James Bible. Now, here's another entry, right? This is an interesting one. Long live Queen James. While riding through the bustling streets of London from 1603 to 1621, one was liable to hear the shout, "Long live Queen James!" Let's go, Brandon. Right? Isn't that how they taunt the people that they obviously know is not right? Okay. This is what they do. It's what we do today. King James I of England and VI of Scotland was so open about his homosexual love affairs that an epigram had been circulated which roused much mirth and nodding of the heads. Elizabeth was king. Now James is queen. Because Elizabeth was way more manly than... Anyway. She was, actually. Very few official biographers still tenaciously maintain that there is no real evidence that James's friendships were merely intimate. The question of whether or not James actually slept with his favorites is dealt with by Lady Antonia Fraser in her biography of King James in an eminently reasonable manner. In sexual matters, it is generally better to assume the obvious unless there is some very good reason to think otherwise. And for Lady Antonia Fraser, anti-gay prejudice is no good reason to think otherwise. Her biography is a sympathetic reprisal of James's personality and statesmanship. She quite simply accepts James' homosexuality. So this chick, Lady Antonia, is like, oh man, what was her name?
And do you think that the country will see the United States will see the first gay president or the first woman president?
We already have it with Obama, so let's just calm down.
Got it.
You know Michelle is a
I'm sorry, she's a what?
A transgender. We all know.
Oh my gosh.
Oh gosh. It's okay. She does it.
Why is this such a big deal? Why are you guys making such a big deal about it, right? Of course he's gay, right? And then died shortly after. Okay. She's like, yeah, it is. That's just what it is. Why are we all making a big deal out of this, right? Like, why are we hiding it too? It's like, so she accepts it, never regards it in and of itself a detriment to either himself or his country, though she reasonably regrets that his favorites were not always the wisest of counselors. Her assessment that most of James's life was a search to recapture the golden youth quality of his early passion for Esme Stuart, the only bright spot in an otherwise bleak childhood deprived of affection, is probably quite accurate, and she's certainly correct that his dominant quality was an inability to resist love. Right? He had favorites, he had these things, and he was very open about it and didn't really necessarily care. So, of course, again, Esme Stuart. Now, this situation was becoming unliked by others, so a conspiracy of nobles was formed against him. In 1582, James was abducted by his would-be protectors. Lennox was ordered to leave the country on pain of death, and the two lovers never saw each other again. So basically all the other relationships, is what they're saying, was his way of trying to recreate this. So going back to the guy who fell off his horse, right? Kind of made him fall for him. Anyway, literally. So after his full recovery, Carr was appointed gentleman of the bedchamber, right? So the guy that fell off his horse. A courtier wrote of their relationship. The prince constantly leaneth on his arm, pinches his cheek, and smooth his ruffled garment. Carr hath all favours. The king teacheth him Latin every morning, and Greek every night. I tell you, this Scottish lad is straight-limbed, well-favoured, strong-shouldered, and smooth-faced, with some sort of cunning and show of modesty. So, leans on his arm, pinches his cheeks, would wrap his arms around Stuart, kiss him on the cheek. That was been witnessed. But then he moved on to Villiers, right? Which is known as his wife. James was fickle, soon found another favorite in George Villiers, whose rise was spectacular. This son of a penniless Leicestershire, again, there's that word, I don't know how to say that, squire was introduced to James in 1614. It is now believed that their first sexual union took place on August 1615, while they were spending a few days together at Farnham Castle. Many years later, Buckingham wrote to James asking whether you loved me now. Better than at the time, which I shall never forget, at Farnham, where the bed's head could not be found between the master and his dog. So there is more of that. Buckingham jokingly called himself James's dog, as in a letter addressed to the dear dad and gossip. Gossip from godparent meaning chum, and closing, your most humble slave and servant and dog Steenie. He began as a royal cup-bearer and became a viscount in 1616 and the Earl of Buckingham in 1617. His relationship with James resulted in the 1617 moral debate of the Privy Council. Sir John Oglander testified before the council that the king is wondrous passionate, a lover of his favorites beyond the love of men to women. He is the chastest prince for the women that ever was. For he would often swear that he never kissed any other woman than his own queen. I never yet saw any fond husband make so much or so great dalliance over his beautiful spouse as I have seen King James over his favorites, especially Buckingham. His relationships were literally causing problems, okay? This is who wrote the King James Bible. Again, reminder, this is whose Bible we're using today after he decided that the people who used the Geneva that came over to America, that Bible was critical of him. Let's not forget this. Let's keep going. Apollo with his songs. Who's Apollo? Debauched young Hyacinthus, just as Cordon, eminence. I can't say everything. So Caesar did not spurn boys. Right? One man, I'm just gonna have to let you guys, does this, a friend of this person. Another does this with this, and it is well known that the King of England, okay, Buckingham was generally regarded as the most beautiful man in Europe. With his dark chestnut curly hair, a pointed beard of golden brown, clear skin, fine chiseled features, dark blue eyes, and the graceful carriage of the ideal courtier. A large number of love letters from James to Buckingham, extending over a period of nearly 10 years, are some of the earliest examples of what might be considered, since most love letters between them have been either destroyed or suppressed. I desire only to live in the world for your sake, and I had rather live banished in any part of the world with you than live a sorrowful widow life without you. And so God bless you, my sweet child and wife, and grant that ye may ever be a comfort to your dear dad and husband. Now, that seems a little confusing because it looks like we're talking about a woman, right? So James in these letters commonly addressed Buckingham as only sweet and dear child, sweet Steenie gossip. Buckingham was named St. Stephen, who was reputed to have had the face of an angel, sweetheart, sweet child and wife, and signs himself thy dear dad and steward, and thy dear dad and husband. In wanton looks and wanton gestures, they, James and Buckingham, exceeded any part of womankind. The kissing them after so lascivious a mode in public, and upon the theatre, as it were, of the world, prompted many to imagine some things done in the tiring house, attiring a dressing room, that exceeded my expression no less than they do my experience. Point being, if this is what they're willing to do out in public, it leads to many to wonder, what on earth do they do? Because he actually undresses that man. Okay, that's what they do. You think they... Okay, I'm not going into this. This is King James. This is the author of the King James Bible again. All right. So here we go. Enigma of the world. From the Privy Council debate in 1617 until 1622, England was in a state constantly verging upon civil war, with James's love for Buckingham being the most visible corruption for the ignorant and the demagogues to attack. James finally decided to dissolve Parliament in 1621, which actually precipitated his own loss of power. The date coincides with the fall of Sir Francis Bacon, who, according to the contemporary Sir Symonds D'Ewes, whatever, was also intimate with Buckingham. Okay. Now, Sir Francis Bacon, the Puritan moralist, right? Sir Symonds D'Ewes, whatever, in his autobiography and correspondence discusses Bacon's love for his Welsh serving men, in particular very effeminate-faced youth whom he calls his catamite and bedfellow. Catamite being a corruption of Ganymede. So, this entry, they're saying, should be read, but has been mostly ignored. Let's read it. The favor he had with the beloved Marquis of Buckingham emboldened him, as I learned in discourse from a gentleman of his bedchamber, who told me he was sure his lord should never fall as long as the said Marquis continued in favor. His most abominable and darling sin I should rather bury in silence than mention it, but it not a most admirable instance, how men are enslaved by wickedness and held captive by the devil. For whereas, presently upon his censure at this time his ambition was moderated, his pride humbled, and the means of his former injustice and corruption removed, yet would he not relinquish the practice of his most horrible and secret sin of sodomy, keeping still on Godric, a very effeminate-faced youth, to be his catamite and bedfellow, although he had discharged the most of his household servants, which was the more to be admired, because men generally, after his fall, began to discourse of that his unnatural crime, which he had practiced many years, deserting the bed of his lady, which he accounted, as the Italians and the Turks do, and a poor and mean pleasure in respect of the other, and it was thought by some that he should have been tried at the bar of justice for it, and have satisfied the law most severe against that horrible villainy, with the price of his blood, which caused some bold and forward men to write these verses following in whole sheet of paper, and to cast it down somewhere in the Yorkshire in the stand where Viscount St. Alban yet lay. Within this sty a hog doth lie that must be hanged for sodomy, alluding both to his surname of Bacon and to that swinish abominable sin. But he never came to any public trial for this crime, nor did ever, that I could hear, forbear his old custom of making his servants his bedfellows, so to avoid this scandal was raised of him, though he lived many years after his fall in the lodgings in Gray's Inn in Holborn, in great want and penury. Sir Francis Bacon's relationship, like those of his king, closely followed the pattern of patron favorite, More specifically, he had a preference for young Welsh serving men. The roll of attendants for Bacon's household in 1618 lists a total of 75 attendants, of whom some 25 were gentlemen waiters. Toby, widely acclaimed for his charm and good looks, had appeared in a play at Gray's Inn in 1595, and he quickly became Bacon's most particular friend, intelligencer, and confidant. Toby had previously served as a spy on the continent where he had met and been befriended by Buckingham. A contemporary observed that Toby, while lodging with Bacon at York House, had grown very gay, or rather gaudy in his attire, and noted for certain night walks to the Spanish ambassador. Toby was the inspiration for one of Bacon's most famous essays of friendship. Even Bacon's mother, Lady Anne Bacon, in a letter to her other son, Anthony, who was openly, complains of that bloody Percy whom Francis kept, yet as a coach companion and a bed companion, as well as others, including Jones, Marks, Ennie, and his Welshmen, one after another. Lady Anne's major distress was not that her son was gay, but that it violated decorum for a nobleman to allow a servant to sleep in the master bedroom. She felt that a lower-ranking bedroom would have been more appropriate. So even she's recognizing the fact that, technically speaking, decorum depicts that noblemen should not allow this to happen, right? But they were doing it anyway, because they had favorites. Had the evidence against Bacon been any more conclusive, Bacon would have suffered the fate of his brother-in-law who shared similar tastes. Mervyn Touchet, second Earl of Castlehaven, and 2 of his servants were executed for homosexual love on May 14, 1631. The master beheaded on the scaffold and the servants hanged in the gallows. Bacon happily followed one of his own principles. A habit of secrecy is both politic and moral. So, I think what I'm going to do is end this particular episode with these individuals, with the thought of the Mayflower and what they were getting away from, okay? I am going to be doing more episodes about other things, the next one being that we are going to go into who came to America and when and what were the reasons. Because the Mayflower reason is not the only, and actually is probably one of the lesser common instances. So, certainly people came over for getting away, but it's very important that we understand who came over and what land was owned by who, so that we can understand what the Paris Peace Treaty of 1783 states. Because it does state something very important down here. Article 4 and Article 5. Which we'll get into next time. But restitution? Who typically is the one who ends up paying restitution, right? Just think about that before we go into the next episode, and let's figure out who paid restitution to who for what damages. So, we'll get into that next time. Peace out, stay tuned.